Okay, morning everyone. My name's Alistair Noyce. I'm based at a university just down the road called Queen Mary, University of London, um, Barts in London School of Medicine and Dentistry. And so I'm just going to give you a quick 15-minute overview on Mendelian randomization, and then Sarah's going to take you through an example of multivariant MR. Now, this is like a really condensed presentation from a workshop that we ran in Montreal for Ziv Ganor's group a couple of months ago, so it's very familiar to certain people in the room. And it's very difficult to kind of convey a lot of information about Mendelian randomization in 15 minutes. He's been sitting for about 7 of these talks and still a mystery. He still tells me every time he doesn't understand a word of what we're saying. So I think the safest thing to assume is no prior knowledge. So I'm sorry if lots of you guys know about MR, but I'm just going to really talk about conceptually why we use it and why it's important, really from an epidemiological standpoint. So we're going to talk briefly about the origins, why MR is necessary, underlying assumptions, and then talk about different ways of doing it. So the real thing that MR is getting at is causality. Okay, that's that a particular trait or a particular exposure or a particular risk factor causally affects trait B, okay, your outcome. Okay, and reverse causality is when trait B affects trait A, your chance of being exposed or your chance. So if I take this example, this is a review article we wrote several years ago, looking at risk factors for Parkinson's. There's lots of geneticists in the room, so you'd recognize the infrequent but strong effect, genetic factors for Parkinson's disease, more moderate effect, genetic risk factors for Parkinson's disease. And then in green, we've got what we tend to call the prodromal features. These are things that happen before you get a diagnosis of Parkinson's: constipation, mood disorder, smell loss, RBD. And then in orange, things that we would term risk factors or protective factors. And I would put to you, I mean, we are kind of classified these in green if we thought they were prodromal, and orange if we thought they were risk or protective factors. But I put to you that for most of these, it's actually hard to know whether they are prodromal features or risk factors. You know, it's at least plausible. If you think about constipation, for example, it's at least plausible that it may not be a prodromal feature. It may itself be a risk factor if there's something in your microbiome, something in your stool that predisposes you to Parkinson's disease, then being constipated could increase your risk of Parkinson's as a consequence of that. So may not be a prodromal feature, may be a risk factor. And the same can be said for all of these. I'll take you through a specific example. This is head injury and the association with Parkinson's disease. So when we see in an observational study an association between head injury and Parkinson's disease, then the assumption that we make from that is that, it must be causally related. So that leads to kind of people talking about public health interventions like banning boxing, banning scenarios where you might acquire a head injury. But of course, the alternative explanation is that something about Parkinson's disease predisposes you to getting head injuries. Okay, so if you're a boxer, you're in the prodromal stage of Parkinson's disease, which is predominantly a movement disorder, you're slowing down, you're a little bit less accurate, you're more likely to get head injuries in that instance. Okay? So then 5 years, 10 years follow, you've had these head injuries at some point in your midlife, and then you get a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, and everyone says, it's the head injury that caused Parkinson's, but really it's occult, subtle motor dysfunction predisposing head injury. And if we take that example of people acquiring head injuries, boxers, for example, they're elite athletes. Okay? They're less likely to drink alcohol. They're less likely to smoke cigarettes. And of course, we know from other observational studies that smoking and alcohol are negatively associated with Parkinson's disease. So it may not be at all that head injury is a risk factor for Parkinson's. It may be that if you're a boxer, you're less likely to drink alcohol, less likely to smoke. And it's those things that are actually increasing the risk of Parkinson's disease. And it doesn't matter whether you do a case control study or a cohort study. I mean, cohort studies have various methodological or design attributes that make them advantageous when it comes to causality. But if you're doing an observational study, you never get completely away from it. Okay? So randomized controlled trials are the best means epidemiologically for conveying causality, because if they're well conducted, they're not susceptible to reverse causality or confounding, because you give people the exposure as part of the design. Okay, so you know you're allocating them the exposure and then following them up for the outcome. And that process of randomization, even if it's done on a large enough scale, evenly distributes the confounding factors between the two arms of the trial. So all you're testing in the perfect randomized control trial is the exposure of interest. Okay? And it's true, if you do observational studies, things cluster together. So biological traits, physiological traits, psychological traits, socioeconomic traits, they cluster together. So you see associations between things far more than one would expect by chance. And the same is not to be said for so on that note, what we do when we do a study is we apply these kind of criteria where we say, okay, did the exposure temporally precede the outcome? Is it plausible that that exposure leads to that outcome? Do we see it consistently across different studies? What's the magnitude? Do we see a dose response? Like if you smoke more, are you more protected against Parkinson's disease? And so on and so on. This is our kind of causal framework if we can't do an RCT. Now, back in 1986, this guy called Martin Katan wrote a letter to Lancet Neurology where he kind of inadvertently happened on Mendelian randomization. So I'll just read out what it says in the boxes. He said, "Sir, it's unclear whether the relation between low serum cholesterol levels and cancer is causal. In many studies, occult tumor may have depressed cholesterol levels, though in others the relation was found when serum cholesterol had been measured many years before the cancer was." Talking about reverse causation, though, saying something about cancer reducing your cholesterol, or is it that low cholesterol increases your risk? He went on to say differences in the acid sequence of apolipoprotein E are major determinants in the differences in plasma cholesterol levels within a population. ApoE has a key role in the clearance of cholesterol from plasma. The synthesis of ApoE is under control of 3 independent alleles located at a single gene locus coding for the major isoforms E2, E3, E4, with respecting population frequency, so on. He went on to say, if naturally low cholesterol favors tumor growth, then subjects with the E2 homozygous and E2, E3 phenotype should have an increased risk of cancer. And so unlike most indices of lipid metabolism, apolipoprotein amino acid sequences are not disturbed by disease. This is the reverse causation bit again. And the ApoE phenotype found in patients will have been present since birth. It's a lifelong exposure to low cholesterol. Okay? A comparison of ApoE phenotypes in cancer patients with those in matched control might thus shed light on the relationship between low cholesterol and cancer. And if it's causal, then the E2 allele should be more common among patients and E3, E4 more common among controls. Okay, and with that, he'd actually happened on the first example of Mendelian randomization. And since then, it's kind of been likened to nature's randomized control trials. So you are, at the point of conception, recruited to thousands of different natural experiments in which you're slightly higher risk of an exposure, slightly lower risk of another. Okay. Please.
Do you think
Yeah.
you end up with
Yeah.
through your entire life?
Yeah. Exactly, and it
should be.
and still in the cells, if you like, that haven't undergone somatic mutation, then you know you've still got this principle of lifelong exposure to a pet.
That's why I do want to do hair crystals. You can actually make some. This is a lot of prep.
Yeah.
I was in with HD. Generally have this problem.
I don't think anyone's done any MR on HD to Edward a couple of years ago, because I think, but on HD progression, it'd be quite interesting to do.
Exactly. HD progression.
So, taking that idea from Katan forwards, MR comes from a kind of wider concept comes from econometrics called instrumental variable analysis, in which you've got your exposure here, X, your outcome here, your confounding factors. We've seen this triangle, and then something upstream of X, which is a proxy, if you like, or an instrument that measures something about X. Okay, so Z is what's termed an instrumental variable if it's strongly associated with X, if it's not associated with C, and if there is no other pathway by which Z affects Y other than via X. Z affects X, and that affects Y, then you can use the relationship between Z and X and Z and Y to make an estimate of how changing your exposure would affect your outcome. So here, ApoE variance, measured cholesterol, risk of cancer. So, you want that one? Mendelian randomization is a very specific form of instrumental variable analysis in which Z is the genotype, right? So a SNP that predicts a change in serum cholesterol can be used to estimate how serum cholesterol affects your risk of cancer. And the RCT analogy holds, so it's an exposure allocated at birth, present throughout life, and the confounding factors, genetic and non-genetic, are evenly distributed. The truth is that these three assumptions for Mendelian randomization actually rarely. Okay, so this one's quite easy to prove. The strength of your kind of genotype association with an exposure. It's a bit harder to prove, but you can, that your genotype is not associated with your confounding factors. But what tends to be the norm rather than the exception is that this genotype, particularly as data sets get larger and larger and larger, that your genotype in some way is related to your outcome other than via your exposure. So this issue, we call that horizontal pleiotropy, and this is generally expected rather than not the rule. And so this is the case where Z is affecting Y via an alternative factor. And if you're using a ratio measure of Z and Y and Z and X to get an estimate for how X affects Y, if there's an alternative pathway, then it's going to be biased. Sure. People are getting more stupid.
Oh, there's one. Well, he has that argument there.
Yeah.
Getting more stupid. People have more babies.
Yeah.
There's that one. And I mean, there's also one where he basically says that you're stupid if you inherit your parents' stupid. You know, but you said it, I just read the headline. But I mean, it's yeah. You know that one.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing that people are exploring now is that like this, Myanmar, and working on is to live within family, such that you're comparing yourself only to your siblings at the same environment.
So it's a bit like an old style twins analysis, but you know, in MRI.
Yeah. So there's some really interesting early results showing you can see associations that go away. Dynastic effects or sort of.
Because I mean, I think there are only two. I mean, I think there was a big analysis done in Rwanda, US. And I think the only two things were height and intellectual. You basically end up marrying people with about the same height. It's really apparent in clinical genetics clinics. You know,
So they're all the same height and same intellect.
No, actually, it's true. What ends up happening is that actually for things like so for intellectual disability, absolutely one of the criteria that decide for developmental disorders is inclusion of family members, and that's using in genetic signaling as well. Is that you need to be out of keeping with your family. It's not just that you have intellectual disability, but you need to be out of keeping specifically with your family and particularly with your siblings. No one really knows. It's basically a decision. The idea being this isn't explainable through generalized. And there is that kind of idea. And there's also the non-assorted mating. there's actually a few cases sitting around in sleep dysplasias that often make people short, where the babies have really, really complicated too short people, family shopping, really short.
You can think of a close example of that.
Yeah.
Okay, so so whilst using these kind of this approach gets to some extent around reverse causality and confounding, one of the things is clearly not as statistically powerful as doing a traditional observation study. And so the early examples of MR used a single SNP that was related to CRP and to estimate how a change in CRP might affect your risk of cardiovascular disease. But these are hugely underpowered studies with very wide confidence intervals. So the big thing that's really changed over the last 10, 15 years is the absolute explosion in GWAS data, where instead of using a single SNP to look at an association with an exposure of interest, you now have many, many SNPs that are independently associated with an exposure of interest, and you can use those independent SNPs together to create an instrument that captures the maximum possible variance in a trait. So if we take an example like body mass index, you might use the SNP that's associated with FTO. That's the strongest effect SNP, but actually now there's I don't know, Ben probably knows, 700 SNPs, Ben, in the latest BMI GWAS, something like that. All independently associated with BMI. So you can use those as one big instrument to capture the maximum variance in BMI. So what you basically do in two sample design, and Carl talked about this, and Dylan talked about it, and Sarah as well. So what you basically do is you take your SNP of interest. If it's a BMI SNP, you take your SNP of interest, and you look at the association with BMI in the BMI GWAS, and then you take exactly the same SNP and look at its association with Parkinson's disease in the PD GWAS. And then you conduct a ratio measure, which we call the Wald ratio, where you're looking at the per effect allele change in your outcome, your per effect allele change in Parkinson's disease, divided by your per effect allele change in your exposure. And that gives you a ratio measure for how much your outcome changes for a unit change in your exposure. And then you do that for every one of those SNPs, every single one of those BMI SNPs. Now, the advantage is not only does it capture maximum variance in your trait, explain variance in your trait, but it also gives you the ability to start to explore the effects of horizontal pleiotropy. Because if you go back to this, yeah, it's here. So if you've got a single SNP here associated with exposure, which is associated with an outcome. If you've got many of these will the non exposure driven effects, the ones that arise through violation of that third assumption, may all be different for those SNPs. Okay, so you can use multiple variants to look at the effects of horizontal pleiotropy, or the risk of horizontal pleiotropy. And we can also use traditional meta-analysis methods to pool the effects across these SNPs. So if we take an example here, we've got 5 SNPs here, okay, all associated with an exposure and looked at for their association with the outcome. And the slope of this line of best fit that's constrained to pass through the origin, is actually your overall effect estimate, change in your outcome per unit exposure. So here's another example. You've got 3 SNPs here associated with exposure and the outcome. They line up here, and you've got this nice line, which is your IVW, inverse variance weighted meta-analysis. And then you've got this 4th SNP, which is associated with exposure and the outcome, but it's got an alternative pathway by which it affects the outcome, the alpha. Okay, and that SNP's an outlier here. So if that SNP's included in your analysis, then it will pull your line down and underestimate your slope. And I'm not going to go through all the different sensitivity analysis that we can do to look for horizontal pleiotropy, where your 3 assumptions of MR hold up, then the best and most statistically powerful analysis you can do is the IVW analysis. But I've already said that that's the exception rather than the rule. So you would normally expect to have to go on and do at least some sensitivity analysis to look for horizontal pleiotropy. And Carl mentioned this in his talk as well. So actually, the best way of seeing whether there's the potential for heterogeneity is to do a heterogeneity test based on all your SNPs and say, okay, how much heterogeneity is there in these effect estimates It may be that the heterogeneous effects are balanced, and you still estimate the overall slope as being the same. But if they're unbalanced, like it was in this previous example here, then you'll get a bias that way. And there's several, probably 10 or 15 now different methods used to look at heterogeneity. I'll give you one example here. So I won't tell you what the exposure of interest here is, but this is 15 SNPs all associated with a particular exposure being meta-analyzed together to see what the combined causal effect of that exposure on the outcome of Parkinson's is. You've got your IVW effect, which is the kind that has the narrowest confidence intervals because it's most statistically powerful, and then 3 different sensitivity analyses here which line up nicely with that IVW effect. And so that's kind of reassuring that if there is some pleiotropy, it's at least balanced and not biasing the overall causal estimate. So what I think Sarah's going to talk you through is calculating an IVW estimate using a multi-SNP instrument, then measuring heterogeneity, and then, if that's significant, what you would do in terms of the sensitivity analysis to try and detect those directional effects. Come on down, sir. And then just to give you, to give a plug, a lot of these analysis you can do yourself in MR-Base, which is a huge platform run by the Bristol group, where they've created a whole load of GWAS data for exposure and outcomes. You can run your own MR analysis. You can either do it within a kind of web app that they have, the MR-based web app, or you can actually do it direct in the R terminal with the 2-sample MR package. And then we, Sarah and Jeff and others in this room, produced this PDMR research portal for people who want to run Mendelian randomization analysis using PD data. Yeah, I think it's gone. It's in press now, isn't it? Like in the hard copy, right? Cool. Do you want to?
Yeah. Okay, so for today's demo, I think Hampton has just circulated a link, right? You sent that email, right? So if you can just click the link and download the folder and just put it in your desktop. And in the meantime, I will go through some explanations so to better understand what's going on with the code. Oh, you didn't get it? No. Okay. Hampton, could you send her? Yeah.
Yeah, I have to give another talk in 20 minutes. So I'm going to run off. But,
okay.
Good luck.
Thank you. Sorry? Yes. Yeah, there is a Google Drive link, and there is a folder inside that is called MR_Pheno MR. Yeah, London. So it's basically the folder where you are going to find the code and all the files that you need to use for the analysis. You didn't receive it? Okay. Okay. Good. Okay, so today we are going to go through a very basic and simple example that is running a multivariant MR analysis for uric acid and Parkinson's disease. I think this is particularly very interesting given all the literature that has been published and has been uric acid over the years. All these papers suggesting that it's neuroprotective for Parkinson's disease. So I think this is cool for clinicians to understand. As Alastair pointed before, Mendelian randomization is kind of a genetic version of a randomized control trial. So some of you might remember this study. This trial, actually, the SURE-PD3 trial. So it was a study of urate elevation in Parkinson's disease. So this was a randomized placebo-controlled and double-blinded trial that was funded by the NINDS, in which there were so many research clinical sites implicated. And the main goal of this study was basically testing whether a treatment that raises blood levels of urate could have any effect on, any protective effect on Parkinson's disease progression. So this study lasted for a couple of years, and I have to say that after this was performed, it was proven that urate levels didn't have absolutely any effect on Parkinson's disease progression. So we are going to run some Mendelian randomization analysis to also observe from the genetic point of view what we can see in terms of inferring causality with genetic data. So before we go through the code that is inside the folder that Hampton just has shared with you, I'm going to explain what we are going to do with that code. So, so as Alastair said, we are interested in inferring causality using a trait of interest. In this case, it's going to be uric acid, and that's going to be our exposure, right? So uric acid is our exposure, and we want to know if that is going to be a protective or a risk factor for an outcome, that in this case is Parkinson's disease, right? So in terms of the bioinformatics scripts that we are going to use and the data, first we are going to use the exposure GWAS data, which is basically all the SNPs that are significantly associated at a genome-wide level, so at 10 to the minus 8, with uric acid, right? So we are going to take the uric acid GWAS, and we are going to extract those SNPs that are going to form our instrument. We call those SNPs instrumental variables in Mendelian randomization. So the first step is defining your instrument. So we obtain those SNPs, and we have that text file that I will show in a bit, which is basically summarizing the information of those SNPs in terms of the SNP of interest, effect allele, the other allele, the beta that is going to always refer to the effect allele, standard error, and so on. Then, second step is going to be clamping the data. We want to make sure that all the SNPs that you use to conform our instrument are independent signals. And of course, like if you take that information from a GWAS, you say, yeah, these are all independent signals. But the threshold that we use in Mendelian randomization for clamping the data is really different than the one that we use in GWAS. In GWAS, you usually consider an R-squared threshold of about 0.2. But in Mendelian randomization, at least by default in the MR-based package and other packages, we use R-squared equal to 0.01 and a KB distance 10,000. So this is important to make sure that we are not violating the Mendel's second law of independent assortment. So this is, you will see in the code, like this is all automatic. You don't need to do anything. Just run a line and the package will basically clamp your data. And then once we have clamped the data from our exposure GWAS, we are going to take those SNPs from the summary statistics from our outcome. In this case, it's the Parkinson's disease summary stats, right? So we are going, yeah.
So the clamping here is much more stringent.
Yeah, it's much more stringent. And you will see a lot of papers that follow less stringent clampings, and they are overestimating the effects and observing effects that are not real. So it's very important. Yeah.
Basically, you end up with.
Yeah. You end up, I think for this, in this particular instance, I think we end up with 31 SNPs that are associated with uric acid, and then we take those effects from the Parkinson's disease summary stats and then infer causality. But it is also important to keep in mind that you need to have a strong instrument. So you need to have SNPs that are going to explain a high, like kind of a large proportion of the heritability of that particular trait. Because if you use a GWAS that is underpowered because you don't have like enough SNPs that are genome-wide associated with that particular trait, you are going to find a null result, and it's not because that particular trait is not associated or is not causally linked with that outcome, but it's just because you don't have the statistical power to detect it. And there are actually quite a lot of tests that you can perform. We usually calculate another R-squared that refers to the variance. So it's basically how much of the heritability is explained by the SNPs that you are using as part of your instrument. And then we also calculate the F statistic that usually if it's above 10, I think is the threshold, isn't it, Carl? Yeah, above 10, then we can say that the instrument is strong to infer causality. So, okay, so the second step, as I said, is getting the effects from the outcome GWAS. In this case, is the Parkinson's disease GWAS. In a bit, I will show how these data look like. It's actually all in the folder, but I will show it to you. Okay, yeah. Say it again. Yes, so the tool that we are going to use, and I'll show in a bit the script, is called ToSample-MR, and that's a package that is part of the MR-based website that is this interface that is used, is an easier way like to infer causality for data that is already available there, and you can observe the effects. But if you have your own summary stats, you are going to use the package, and this package has been developed by the same people than the MR-based interface. So the next step, and this is really important, is harmonization of your data. So harmonization is basically checking that or making sure that the effect of the SNPs in the exposure corresponds, and the effect of the SNPs in your outcome corresponds to the same allele. Okay, so for example, here we have in the exposure GWAS, we have for the second SNP, we have that the effect allele is G, right? And here the effect, this is the beta value, is negative. While here in the outcome GWAS, we have that the effect allele is T, right? And we see here the effect that is positive. This is the beta value. So in this case, we have to make sure that to infer causality, we are referring to the same allele. So this is something that, again, the package is going to do by itself. So we see here what the package does. So basically, it's going to switch the alleles. So the effect allele is going to be G in the same way as in the exposure GWAS. And the only thing that the package does, if you see here, is that it changes the directionality of the beta. So the package will do that automatically, and then you are ready to go. Great. So do you all have the folder in your desktop? Yeah? Good. To run this, you are going to need RStudio. I don't know who has RStudio. If you struggle, let me know, and I can help you later. So let's go. So you are going to need RStudio, and you are going to need to install the package and some libraries. So I have here some instructions of everything that you have to do. So you are going to open that folder, and in the folder, you are going to find a script that is .r, finishes in .r. You are going to open that. Okay, so I know some of you are not very familiar with scripts at all, so I'm just going to keep it very basic. So first of all, you are just going to need to set your working directory. In my case, I put this folder in desktop, so I'm just going to run it there. So I'm already in the directory that I have to be. Then the second step is, as I said, installing all the packages and loading the libraries. In my case, I'm not going to reinstall everything, obviously, because it's already here. But you guys are going to need to run these 3 lines. Some people, sometimes it doesn't work, so you'll need to unmute this and actually run also, install those other 2 packages. Yeah, are you all following kind of this demo, more or less? Okay. I'm going to load the 2 libraries. So the libraries that I need for this is ggplot, because we are going to generate a forest plot to visualize our results. And the other library is, is to sample lemma, so the package that we are basically using. All right, so within that folder, you are going to have all the files that we need to run this. So the file that corresponds to the GWAS summary stats for the exposure is called uric_acid_instrument. Yeah. So I'm just going to read it. And here's how this is supposed to look like. So your data needs to be in this format. So you are going to have your phenotype. In this case, is uric acid, is our exposure of interest. Then you are going to have the SNPs that are genome-wide associated with uric acid. Then you are going to have the effect allele, that is the allele that is going to refer to the beta. Beta is the exponential of odds ratio, right? Logarithm of odds ratio. Then you have the other allele. Then you are going to have the EAF, that is the frequency for the effect allele. And this is important for harmonization. So this information is what the package uses for harmonization. And then finally here, the standard error. Then I'm just going to run these few lines to kind of format a little bit the data. Sometimes this is to make sure that basically R understands that whatever has to be a character is going to be a character, and whatever is numerical is going to be numeric. So I'm just going to run these 4 lines here. Yeah. Is everybody following, or do you have any questions? All good? Yeah. Then the next step is going to be another step to format the data using the package. So I'm just going to run it, and it says inferring p-values, okay? And then the next step is going to be clamping the data. So I'm going to clamp the data. And this is telling me that the package has removed 4 of the SNPs that I included initially, according to, as I said, the default parameters. So we have clamped the data, and then now we have, here it is, we have 27 SNPs rather than 31. Well, so we've done already the first and the second step. Now the third step is going to be basically getting those SNPs from the summary stats from the outcome, which in this case is Parkinson's disease. So let's go and read summary stats from PD for those SNPs. Again, we are going to do some formatting of the data to make sure that the effect allele and other allele are formatted as characters and so on. Again, we are going to format the data for the outcome. And then the fourth step and the last step before running the analysis is harmonization. So in this case, this is going to check that effect for the exposure and the outcome refers to the same SNP, but also, and importantly, if there are palindromic SNPs, so those are SNPs that are read in the same direction, like this or like this, we don't know if it refers to the forward or the reverse strand, so those are going to be removed from the analysis as well. So this is harmonizing the data. It's done. And then finally, we are going to run the general Mendelian randomization analysis. So we run this line. It's analyzing right now. And then we can visualize the results here. So we have here, as Alastair mentioned before, so this is the inverse variance weighted method. That's like the kind of main method for Mendelian randomization, and the rest are like sensitivity analysis. So as you see, so here we have the beta, so the magnitude of effect for all the instrumental variables within that particular instrument on the risk for Parkinson's disease. Here we have standard error, and then there we have the p-value. As you see, everything is non-significant. So this is a null effect. We can also visualize this as a forest plot. So we calculate the effect for each particular SNP on Parkinson's disease risk. And then we can generate here in an easy way a forest plot. So here we have our forest plot. Let me visualize it in a bigger way. Yeah, so here it is. So here we have all the SNPs that were significantly associated with uric acid in the exposure GWAS, right? We have extracted those effects from the Parkinson's disease GWAS summary stats, and this is the effect that we observe for each of those particular SNPs that conform our instrument. And here we have the inverse variance weighted and Eger. Both are closing the zero. This means nothing is significant. There is no protective effect, or there is no link effect, causal link in between uric acid and Parkinson's disease risk. It's true that the study, the SURE-PD3 trial, aimed at considering if urate was neuroprotective for Parkinson's disease progression. In this case, we couldn't do it using Parkinson's disease progression summary stats because they are unpowered. So we don't have a statistical power to prove the null, and therefore we didn't do it.
You can explain the plot.
Yes, so the plot is, sorry, yeah, I didn't explain in detail. So for each of these SNPs, you have the beta, right? This is the confidence interval, and this is your estimate for each of those SNPs, right? So if there is a significant effect, so a causal link, either risk or protective for your outcome, that is Parkinson's disease, you are meant to see these lines either over there completely not crossing the line, but like on the right or the left. Like, so if you see those lines here, that's risk. You see the lines here, that's going to be protection. Yeah? Because if the beta is positive, right, is risk. If the beta is negative, then you see protection.
Three SNPs there.
Yes, you have these 2 or 3 SNPs here. One of the things that Alastair was talking about is horizontal pleiotropy, which is sometimes within your instrument, you are going to find some SNPs that are basically already associated with Parkinson's disease through different mechanisms that is not through increasing or decreasing levels of your exposure, in this case, uric acid. And that can happen because you are going to have like a lot of SNPs that will be significantly associated with your exposure. But in general, if you assess the overall effect of your instrument that represents very well the phenotype that you want to study, if you don't see any effect, it's because there is no effect. Yeah. Sometimes you'll see as well, this is, I will run a couple of lines for you to see that, the heterogeneity in that instrument. You are going to see some SNPs that are going to suggest risk and others that are going to suggest protection. But maybe you are going to observe that overall in your instrument, you observe like a risk or protective effect. And this is not true. It's just because you have a lot of heterogeneity. So there is a way to also correct for that. Yeah, and you check that through these 2 lines that are going to give you more information based on the sensitivity analysis. So let's run first heterogeneity. So here's the heterogeneity value. There is heterogeneity. As you see in the forest plot, there are like some SNPs that suggest risk and others that suggest protection. In this case, because the p-values are all like negative, we don't care about, but if you will observe like a positive result, then you have to make sure that you have corrected for heterogeneity. And there are some tests like radial inverse variance weighted and so on that are going to remove those outliers and like reconsider the analysis again to see if the effect is consistent or not. And you can also run here other type of pleiotropy test to see if there are a lot of SNPs within your instrument that are going to be associated with Parkinson's disease through different mechanisms than through uric acid. Maybe this is a bit abstract to understand, but I can give an example. Is let's say that you run this analysis and you observe that, rheumatoid arthritis is causally linked with Parkinson's disease. And then you start like digging and digging in terms of pleiotropy and heterogeneity, and you realize that this is only due because of HLA, right? So you cannot say that, you can say that there is a correlation, that there is a genetic correlation between both traits, but it's not causality, because this is only due to HLA, right? Is HLA what is driving that risk for Parkinson's disease? It doesn't mean that rheumatoid arthritis is going to be a risk factor for Parkinson's disease. Is it clear?
You actually block the HLA region is such an issue. You actually block it out of analysis? No. I mean, do you screen it out?
We actually, for example, for LDS core regression, I think that gets removed. I think LDSC directly removes that chunk of data. For Mendelian randomization, I don't think this happens automatically. So yeah, it doesn't happen, right, Carl? Yeah. Yeah.
You do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing is, smaller and smaller. They're real, but they're small. I mean, is that ever going to present a problem in terms of analysis of this kind? Like the kind of Pritchard issue of like whether there's so much pleiotropy across the gene that actually in a way
Yeah.
problem to solve. I mean, I don't know whether you think that's going to be. You're nodding, so I see.
Yeah, I mean, what I think is, yeah, there is going to be pleiotropy for sure. So this doesn't mean that pleiotropy cannot exist. It can exist, but it has to be balanced, right? So if the SNPs that form your instrument are equally associated with the exposure than with the outcome, you don't need the exposure for anything. Like those SNPs are directly associated with the outcome. But if those SNPs are way more associated with exposure than with the outcome, like only slightly associated with the outcome, we kind of say that there is like a balanced horizontal pleiotropy and it's not affecting that much. It's like, yeah.
One of these SNPs in that forest plot, and it's centered around that with some variation. And it's extra unbalanced or balanced, but extra source of variation. Each SNP having pleiotropy, and if your test function is called unbalanced pleiotropy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's different. It's very different. So LDS core regression aims at understanding if there is genetic correlation, so basically pleiotropy between two traits. In this case, what we want to assess is causality. So it's different. Yeah, so that's the main difference between both methods. No, I think LDS core regression is going to consider SNPs that are within those, haplotypes, and then is going to give a score for each of the SNPs in the genome according to how big is the haplotype where the SNP is. So the bigger is the haplotype is, the bigger the score is going to be, because the assumption is that if a variant is within a particular haplotype, the bigger it is, the highest is the probability that it's going to be tagging a causal variant. That's like kind of the assumption. Yeah. And then there are colocalization methods like Bayesian colocalization, but that's another different method. And it's used like when you find a pleiotropic effect through linkage disequilibrium score regression, then you can further explore that with the colloc package, or I think some people, I think you guys have done like quite a lot of colocalization, right? So, oh, David. Yeah.
You, Alistair mentioned that variance weight is the effect as the one they use. Is there a time where the other one that you will actually?
Yeah, so Eger is going to be much more conservative
Yeah.
than the inverse variance weighted, and those are used like kind of like sensitivity analysis to understand what's going on in terms of pleiotropy or heterogeneity, to see if the effect that you are observing is real or is due to confonders or pleiotropy or and so on.
So it's higher. You want to use more Eger or more?
Yes, you definitely have to take in consideration all these methods, and there are additional, these are like the basic methods, but for example, one of the methods that I mentioned is the radial inverse variance weighted, that is going to consider all the heterogeneous outliers, like all the SNPs that might be pleiotropic SNPs and so on, is going to tell you which ones, and it's going to nominate those outliers so you can remove them from the analysis and rerun it again in order to see if there could be a causal effect. Yeah. And then I also put here another example. I'm not going to go through it because it's quite late, but you guys have it in the folder. So it's basically the same procedure that we just follow for uric acid and Parkinson's disease, but this is going to be for cholesterol and ALS. And in this case, you are going to see a positive effect, which is a nice example to study. All right.